Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to the IoT Village virtual event 2.0. We are going to get live here in just a minute with our first speaker of the day, our keynote speaker, Ted Harrington. For those of you that don't know Ted, he is the executive partner at ISC, Independent Security Evaluators, which is the founder of IoT Village, and Ted is one of our co-founders. Ted is also the #1 best-selling author of the book Hackable, which is coming out on audiobook this spring. So make sure to mark your calendars. It's going to be coming out around May. And we'll drop links to the sign-up form for that as well in Discord. A really cool thing I want to cover today is that not only is Ted going to be here giving a presentation, but right after the keynote is done, Ted's going to be in our Hackable Networking Lounge. So after his talk, I'm going to be dropping a link in Discord for you to join that networking lounge and to meet the author. And those of you that join, we're going to drop a form in the chat, and you're going to be eligible to win a signed copy of the book of Hackable, which is really awesome. Another really cool thing that's going on today is we have our Security Consulting Networking Lounge. In that lounge, we're going to have experts from the industry in there live, ready to answer your security needs. What questions do you have? What do you need advice on? We will be doing breakout rooms with you if you have really specific questions about your brand or your organization. So be sure to check that out. I'm going to drop the link to that Google Meet here in just a minute. But yeah, Ted's going to be talking about how IoT security is application security. He's going to be sharing some stories that are covered in the book, as well as some new ones. Fun fact about Ted is that Ted is an up-and-coming TikTok influencer. Okay, if you follow Ted on LinkedIn, you may be seeing some of those TikToks going around. So definitely connect with Ted on LinkedIn to see more of those. Follow him on TikTok as well. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Ted.
Yes, TikTok, the height of my professional achievement. TikTok is fun, man. It's a great way to communicate ideas. So yeah, let's have some TikTok chats. Well, thanks, Rachel, and thank all of you guys for spending some time here together today. It's really exciting for me, and it's an honor to be able to serve in this capacity, to bring this community together. So before I get into any ideas, let me start by posing a question. If you saw a purse getting stolen, would you go chase after the thief? Now, that's a hypothetical question that most of us never have the real world opportunity to be able to answer. We can think about it hypothetically, but pretty rarely are we actually in the situation to find out what would we do. Well, I did. See, right before everything closed down for pandemic, I was at this bar, and there was a big commotion going on right behind me. As I turned around, what had happened was there was a woman sitting at a bar top that was basically right at the street. It was one of these garage doors that is basically the exterior wall. So for all intents and purposes, she was like on the sidewalk, and her purse was sitting right on top of the bar top. And a thief had walked by and was very opportunistic, saw this purse, snatched it, and just took off. And I learned something about myself that day, which was, yep, I'm the crazy person who would run after the thief. And so along with a couple other guys from the bar, we just took off. I mean, I didn't even decide. It just was instinct. I just did it. And one thing that I think is maybe important to note in the context of the story is that one of my hobbies, like how I spend my time outside of the office, is running. And I'm a pretty competitive person. So here I am running down the middle of the street, chasing this person at, full all out sprint, literally screaming at him and talking trash. I'm like, oh, it's on, mother effer, and of course I'm like very much swearing. I'll spare you the profanity, but I'm swearing at this guy. I'm like, oh, it's on. I'll run all day. I got you. I don't know why that was necessary, but I guess it was. And so as the thief, he turns this corner, and as we turn this corner, one of the other guys that was in pursuit as well is this tall, sort of rock and roll looking guy, long hair, tie-dye t-shirt, and he's wearing these boots. And these boots were really not designed for a foot pursuit. And so as he's turning this corner, he winds up slipping. And so he's sort of, the way he falls, he's like slides basically right under me. And so, I jump over him so I don't trip on him or hurt him or anything. And, as I'm sort of mid-flight, I look back at him and I'm like, you okay? And this dude lying on the ground, he's like, get him. He's like yelling at me, like, go get this guy. So I'm like, all right. So I land and, I'm in pursuit. And I'm almost within arm's length of this purse thief. And he turns again. And he turns into a dark alley. Now, maybe my survival instincts were on pause at that moment because this was not necessarily the best decision, but I chased him into this dark alley. Now, it's not a good idea because he's someone who's desperate enough to steal a purse. Like, is a dark, narrow alley the right place that I want to find myself with a person like that? But nevertheless, I chase him in with the one other guy who's still standing. And it turns out that we lose the guy. Now, we didn't know this at the time, but what had happened, he sort of disappeared and we didn't know where, but where he disappeared is he had slipped in the back door of yet another bar. So remember the rocker guy? He skids on the ground, he falls, he sends us along on our way, and as he pops back up and decides what to do next, a car is turning the corner. So he literally stops the car. He's like, stop, like almost like citizen's arrest or something. And the car stops. And he gets in the car with these people are like, yeah, some guy who yells at me to stop the car. Of course, let's get him in the car. Like I still don't understand that whole scenario, and I don't know what happened next. I don't know if it was like instinct or there was some like spiritual, like, I don't know how this happened, but he directed the people driving the car to, basically go around the block and to go drop him off at that bar that we had actually flushed the thief into. We didn't know he was in there. No one saw him go in there, but the rocker guy gets out. And so as the thief sort of bursts in that back door of this bar, he thought he got away. There's the rocker dude. And he going, drop the purse. And of course there's all these people in the bar like holding their beer like, what is happening right now? And so the good guys won that day. The police came, apprehended the purse thief, and there was a really cool moment a few minutes later when the boyfriend of the woman whose purse it was that got stolen, he walks back to the original bar where the whole thing started, holding the purse like overhead like a trophy, and the place is going nuts. Like everyone's cheering, people are hugging each other. The bar buys drinks for everybody. It was a really, really cool moment to be part of. So why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you the story as a representation of community, because that's what IoT Village is about. So just like how in that story, none of us on our own would have been able to apprehend that thief, but together we were able to solve this problem. That's what a community does, and that's what IoT Village is about. We founded IoT Village in order to create this sense of community so that we could all collaborate on how to drive the industry forward, how to improve security in connected devices. But one of the challenges that I've noticed over the many years that we have been running IoT Village, and the many years that we've been publishing research on connected devices, and the many years that we've been advising companies who hire us to help them find and fix their security vulnerabilities, I've noticed this really interesting disconnect. And the disconnect is that people tend to think that IoT security is this new emerging field, kind of never been seen before. And in some senses, that's true. It is new. There are elements to it that have never been seen before. But the fundamental truth is that the way that we deal with these challenges, we've known how to deal with these challenges for a long time. And that's why I make the argument, which I'm going to present to you today, that IoT security is application security. I'm going to present to you 5 principles that prove that fact. And then I'm going to share with you a method for how to actually think about finding the security vulnerabilities that matter so that we can fix them. Because if we can do all those things, if we can sort of correct this misconception about the role of IoT security in the broader security context, if we can correct that misconception, we can actually make a difference. And as a community, we all can do that. So that's my mission here today. So with that, let's dig into it. Now, as Rachel mentioned, I did come out with this book. And by the way, my name's on the cover, but it shouldn't be alone. I mean, this was a total team effort by everybody at ISE. There's so many stories in here that come out of IoT Village. And the only reason I mention the book right now is because I'm going to tell you a few stories here today that come directly out of this book, and the insights come out of this book. And so it might raise an eyebrow when you say, well, that book's about application security. What does it have to do with IoT security? And that is my point. IoT security is application security. So first principle I want to share with you is this idea that mindset drives outcomes. So how we think actually determines what we achieve. And this is one of these areas that people often don't actually realize is a problem, don't realize that they have to do something about addressing, because it doesn't really feel very technical or scientific or complex, right? It's almost like, well, why does it matter how we think? What we need to do is we need to find these types of issues, right? No, we need to start with the right mindset, the right attitude. So there was a story that I can share with you from a few years ago. So let's talk about injecting drugs into your spine. We were working with a company that had this medical device that was an infusion pump that injected drugs into your spine. And we had just completed a security assessment of their device. And we were in their, big corporate boardroom presenting the results. And this is something that we like to do for our clients when we can, where we walk them through the different attack scenarios, what the issue is, how severe it is, what to do about it. I mean, all these details are, of course, included in the report that we supply them, but it's a really important way to make sure that the client actually understands the problems, can take action on them, can ask clarifying questions, etc. So as we're walking through these issues, in the room is basically the whole leadership team. The CEO is there, the CTO, I think even the CFO might have been there, definitely members of the development team, etc. And as we're walking through the different attack scenarios, the CEO interrupts us. And he says, this really isn't as bad as you suggest. Now, of course, we had literally just talked about how an attacker could manipulate the device in a way that actually hurts or potentially kills patients. And his reaction was, this isn't that bad. So, of course, we were very interested to hear why he felt that way. And so we asked him to elaborate. And he said, look, even though what you say could happen, I'm just not that worried about it. And still a little bit stumped. We, encourage him to elaborate. He says, look, let me put it this way. He says, I drive a BMW. I love that car. I would never want to see it get scratched. Now, theoretically, someone could haul a piano up onto the roof of our building, throw it off the roof onto my car, and destroy my car. Theoretically, that could happen. But I'm just not that worried about it. Now, we are quite literally in the profession of seeking the unexpected, and that still was shocking to me. This device now has known issues in it that could cause harm to patients, and the reaction was, let's minimize the problem. Instead of solve the problem, instead of make a better product, let's try to minimize the problem. And the story has, kind of a sad ending that I certainly don't celebrate, but is, I think, an effective cautionary tale in that when they went to try to go get approval of this device with the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, who's in charge of approving devices for use on patients, this company's sort of minimizing attitude towards security wasn't really well received, and they were not allowed to, they did not receive approval for use of their product on patients. And because they couldn't sell it, of course, they pretty quickly went out of business. And that's a bummer. I definitely don't celebrate that failure. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur myself. I want to celebrate entrepreneurial success. But the point here is that how we think about security and how we approach it determines what will happen. In this case, that organization, they didn't want to get better. So they didn't try to get better. So they didn't get better, and it ended badly. And so what we want to do is we want to have the opposite, right? We want to seek excellence. We want to think about how can we be better today than we were yesterday? And how can we be better tomorrow than we are today? So principle number 2, to recap, to finalize the point on principle number 1, I forgot to connect the dots here. So to connect these dots, everything I just described, that's IoT and that's AppSec, right? IoT security is application security. Both of these problems, both of these domains share the same principle. How you think determines what you achieve. We're going to talk about this again in principle 2, which is this idea of understanding assets. A few years ago, I was asked by a very prominent organization in the travel industry to help them lead a volunteer-based working group to help them look at this challenge of how can we turn your phone into the key. So this is what's called mobile keys. So the idea is when you go to a hotel, rather than getting the plastic key card, you can use your phone as the key to access your room and a bunch of other things that you can do with it across the property. And so, of course, now there's two different types of connected devices here. There's the door lock and there's the phone itself. And they were really interested in, as they sort of change this, as they introduce this new technology, how does this change the attack scenario in a hospitality context? And so they asked me to help them think through that. And of course, I enthusiastically agreed. I thought that was a really interesting problem to look at. I myself want to use my phone as a key in hotels when I travel. So I had some skin in the game, so to speak. And the first thing that we did in this working group was we started interviewing all these different stakeholders. And I was asking the question, what do you care about? What do you want to protect and why? And an interesting thing happened. So the first person that I went to, their answer was, and I'm sort of oversimplifying things here, but the first person's answer was, well, we care about protecting the safety of guests. Guest safety matters. Okay, cool. Got it. So I went to the second stakeholder and I said, okay, what do you care about protecting? And they said, we care about protecting corporate information, like the business intelligence we have on property. I said, oh, okay. Well, what about guest safety? And they said, oh, yeah. Oh, that's a good one. Definitely. Yeah, we really care about that. Okay. So I went to the third stakeholder and asked them what they cared about. And they said, oh, we care about the integrity of the data on the lock itself, because it tells us certain things about who accessed the lock when, and it informs all these types of things that we need to know. And I said, okay, interesting. Well, what about the corporate intelligence, the business information that lives on property? And they said, oh, yeah, that's definitely important. Yeah, we care about that. I said, okay, cool. What about guest safety? I said, yeah. Oh, that's really important too. Definitely. We care about that. And so what this really revealed to me in a very sort of shocking way is that although all these different people were all gathered around the same mission, they really weren't actually aligned at all until we started having these conversations and started asking, what do you want to protect? And you'd be surprised how often it happens in organizations where, because they don't necessarily go through that explicit exercise, there's an assumption that everybody knows what it is they're trying to protect. And there's an assumption that everybody understands how these priorities rank. Those assumptions wind up being invalid, as evidenced by the story that I just mentioned. And so again, here's an example where, hey, is that IoT security or is it application security? You need to understand what you need to protect in order to be able to protect it. Principle number 3, we need to understand attacker motivation. All too often, I hear the idea of hacker, right, lumped as to just one thing. And it's always meant, if you read it in the media, hacker always means an evil or sort of malicious type person who does bad things. And that's really not true, because what a hacker is somebody who looks at a system the way that and tries to understand the way that it behaves, and then says, hey, can I make it do something different? And the distinction between the ethical hackers, people like those who work at a company like ours and our peers, versus an attacker, the distinction is motivation. Ethical hackers seek to understand how the system can work the way it's not supposed to in order to fix it, whereas the attackers want to understand that in order to abuse it. And then within the attacker group, there's all these different motivations, from profit to notoriety, geopolitical advantage, corporate espionage. There's an enormous list. And it's really critically important that we understand, why would an attacker want to attack a given system? Because that helps us think about, well, would they want to attack my system? Do I need to think about that attacker? And then there's this really interesting wrinkle, which is that sometimes it's not super straightforward and obvious what the motivation for that attacker might be. So perfect example is what happened with the Mirai botnet. Now, my guess is many of you might be familiar with this, but if you're not familiar with it, the Mirai botnet was an example from a few years ago where it was around 100,000 of these inexpensive surveillance cameras that were designed to be used for like mom and pop type shops. And these were all, internet connected surveillance cameras. And they were all compromised in this idea of a botnet, which essentially takes this, it sort of mobilizes all these compromised devices in order to, almost like a zombie army, make them go do something together, perform an attack together. And the Mirai botnet basically capitalized on these weaknesses across all these internet connected surveillance cameras and then focus the laser beam of all of that processing power onto an element of the internet backbone. And as a result, huge portions of the East Coast of the United States were not able to access the internet. So all these services that ran on the internet were completely unusable for like hours. And what's really, really important to note about that is that this attack is attributed to, it's still not fully clear who it's attributed to, but it's either to an organized crime group or a nation state actor. And the theory is that what was happening was that these attackers were essentially probing the system to see what might happen and how might the United States react, and how might the internet react. And so there's a great example where, that company that was making that surveillance camera for the mom and pop shop probably does not think that a nation state or organized crime actor is in any way going to target their system. But we have to think broader than that. We have to think like the attacker. We have to understand what motivates the attacker so that we can think about, well, how might that play out in an attack against my system? And this is one of the real common issues that I see across IoT, where people kind of think that, well, why would anyone attack this little thing? And again, this applies to IoT security as well as application security. The principle is the same. Principle 4, we have to understand the attack surface. So we just talked about what you want to protect and who you might want to defend against. And now we got to think about, like, where might we be attacked? We published a piece of security research called Hacking Hospitals that was focused on this hypothesis that was exploring, could an attacker cause harm or fatality to a patient? And we were really interested in exploring that. And there were a number of different aspects to this piece of research. But one I wanted to point out in particular is that IoT was, of course, one of the pieces that was right at the center of this. And one element in particular was the patient monitor, the bedside monitor. Now, you're probably familiar with this idea. It's the thing that sits in the hospital room where the patient is, right next to the bed, and it reports like O2 levels and heartbeat, stuff like that. Now, this is what's called a passive medical device. Up to this point, most of security in healthcare, and actually still today, most of security in healthcare really focuses not on security, but focuses on privacy. It focuses on, can someone steal your patient information? Then within the subset of the healthcare sphere that does actually really focus on security, what we had seen at the time was there was a lot of emphasis talking about active medical devices. Now, active medical devices are things like a pacemaker. An active medical device actively does something to a patient. So a pacemaker is a great example. It's pretty clear to see how if someone could manipulate the pacemaker that manipulates your heartbeat, how that could actually hurt somebody. But we didn't see anybody looking at passive medical devices. A passive medical device doesn't do something to the patient. It reacts to the patient. A bedside monitor is a great example of a passive medical device. It's not administering care. It's reporting on the patient's vital signs. Well, what we found as we were looking at this particular system was a combination of things. First, that an attacker could bypass authentication and then could perform remote code execution. So what that meant was that an attacker from really anywhere in the world could actually make that device behave however they wanted it to behave. So here's what that meant. That meant that an attacker could cause the nurses and the physicians to react in certain ways. So one way is they could make them respond to false alarms. Now, this is actually the lesser dangerous of the two because there are some fail-safes in the process of delivering care. But let's just say, for an example, that a false alarm was triggered that says, hey, this patient's having a heart attack. The nurse or the physician runs in and they are going to determine, is this person in fact suffering? And if so, they're going to administer the electric paddles. Now, if this person doesn't need the electric paddles and gets the electric paddles, that could be fatal. Now, fortunately, there is a fail-safe in there where usually there's some sort of manual or visual check, but also hospitals are a chaotic environment. And it's not out of the realm of possibility that in a rush to deliver care, that's, a mistake like that might happen. But even if no mistake ever happens around that, bad things still happen, which is now care has been drawn away from where it's needed to where it's not needed. And that's really bad because other patients on that floor who need that care are now going to suffer. The opposite is also true and is way worse. And that's the idea that an attacker could disable legitimate alarms. So that means now let's imagine the patient who is having that heart attack, who does need care, but the patient monitor doesn't signal the alarm to the nurse or to the physician. That patient's going to suffer. These are examples of where the attack surface, which is of course the way that through the web interface that the device was attacked, helps us think more sort of holistically and broadly about this idea of patient safety. And again, that's an IoT problem we've talked about, but really, we're talking about application security here. And then principle 5, we have to secure it and then prove it. One of the core themes that I identified when I was evaluating what problems I wanted to help solve in writing Hackable was this idea that there's really almost two pieces. One piece is organizations need to actually build better, more secure solutions. And then the second is they need to be able to prove it, right? They need to be able to use security as a differentiator. Almost everybody that I interviewed throughout the entire process of writing the book said some version of that. Security is a differentiator. You don't need to look any further than marketing websites for any IoT device that will say something about security. Now, the problem though, with those claims about security that I've noticed across many IoT systems for their marketing sites is that the claims usually aren't based on actually securing the system. And we can't do it that way, right? We can't say that it's secure if we haven't actually secured it. You know, people all the time are saying things like highly secure, military grade encryption, bank level security. And all these things don't really speak to the actual threat model and don't speak to what has been done in order to actually harden this system. They speak more to like, here's what encryption we're using. That's like saying, you know, this Hyundai is a luxury car because it uses the same tire pressure as a Rolls Royce. Yeah, maybe those do use the same tire pressure, but that's overreach to say that the Hyundai is the same as a Rolls Royce, just like it's an overreach to say, well, we use the same encryption as a bank, thus we're as secure as a bank. It just doesn't work that way. And we had this almost comical experience where we published some research looking at routers. And when we're going through the research process, we went through this thing that many of you are probably familiar with called responsible disclosure. And if you're not familiar with it, responsible disclosure is the process where a security researcher will, once they found vulnerabilities, they'll disclose them to the afflicted party, to the manufacturer, or whoever makes the system. And the purpose is to help that organization get better, to help them fix the problem so that then the researcher can ultimately go on and present the findings and make sure that none of the like attack details are being given out to the bad guys. Well, one of these vendors that was included in the scope of this research on routers, we contacted them over and over and over and over again. I mean, we're talking about over the course of months. They never replied to a single outreach, not even to say like, thanks, but no thanks, just ignored. So responsible disclosure concluded. We came to the point where we had to go publish the research, of course, redacting any information that would be exploitable. And we worked with a member of the press and the story was published. Well, who calls us that same day? The same day that that story came out, that company that we'd been calling over and over and over and over again called us up and said, hey, we saw the news. We saw that we were included in your research. And they said, we want to change things. Now, this was an amazing moment because we're saying that's the point. That is what research is about. How can we help drive for better? How can we make tomorrow better than today? And here was a company saying, hey, we want to change things. It's like, that's awesome. That's the dream scenario. And so they said, can we send someone to your office? And we're like, cool. Yeah, let's do it. I mean, we would have done this over the phone, but sure, let's do it. So they flew an executive from the Bay Area to our West Coast office in San Diego. And this person, it became very clear within about 5 minutes what this person was there to do. They weren't actually there to try to change the product, to try to improve the product. They were there to get us to change the report. And that was a little disheartening for us because we're like, oh, we thought we were going to have this really productive conversation about, improving it. But nevertheless, we said, hey, look, we're here to collaborate with you. So You have the findings now. So go fix those issues. Come back to us. We'll issue an updated report. Perfect. Everybody wins. That was the ultimate goal. And they said that they went and changed things, and they, in fact, just didn't change anything. And they tried to tell us, hey, everything's good now. And we said, nah, you didn't, like, literally nothing has changed. And then very comically, I want to frame this thing. They sent us a memo. It literally had a rubber stamp on it that said certified. Like, literally someone took a stamp, put it in red ink, and then stamped this piece of paper, and it said certified. And the memo said, we self-certify there are no vulnerabilities in this product. We're like, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, they're still there. And that's a really, really good example of how we should not be thinking, right? We should not be thinking that if we just tell people it's secure, that's good enough. And that's not good enough. We have to actually secure the thing. But the beauty is, once we secure it, then we can prove it. And that's one of the main arguments that I make in the book. It's one of the things that many of our customers are looking for when they come to hire us, is they're saying, hey, look, our customers say this to us. They say, hey, look, our customers, so like our customer's customer, they're like, our customers are asking all these questions about security. I want to prove to them that this thing is secure. Well, if you do it right, you can actually do that. You can gain that competitive advantage. The buyer wants things to be secure. And if you secure it first, then there are ways you can prove it. And that is hugely differentiating. It stands in sharp contrast against companies who just try to say they're secure without doing it. Again, as with all of the previous principles that I mentioned, is that IoT security? No, that's application security. Like, we've known these things for a long time. IoT security, for all the ways that it's new and different and emerging and never before seen, the way that we approach the problem is the way that we've approached it all along. So how do we do that? Okay, so Ted's introduced some principles. Here's the 5 principles of how the things are the same. All right, fine. Now what do we do? How do we know if we're actually doing security right? How do we find the issues that matter so that we can actually improve our system? Well, there is a method to the madness. Now, I present this in the form of a triangle, and some of you might look at this and think of something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which, if you're not familiar with that term, it comes from psychology, which basically says, like, you definitely need the things on the bottom, and hopefully you can get the things on the top. But that's not what this is. This is, you need everything, assuming you have something worth protecting. If you're building a system that doesn't have anything worth protecting and there's no attack scenario that could result in something bad, then this doesn't apply. But I'm assuming that you do. You need all of these things. But there's a lot of misconceptions about how to approach finding issues so you can fix them. Okay, so everything that we're talking about here operates under this assumption that an organization who's building something works with an organization who's securing something, a security company, an outside security company, security tester, penetration tester, ethical hackers. Like, different people are calling these things different things, though those terms all do mean different things. But the idea is someone from the outside, someone who hasn't built it. And the first step, because of course we have this assumption that, the person who's not building it is looking at it from a security standpoint, is they need to understand the design. They need to understand, how is the system built? How does it provide access? What does it provide access to? How are users onboarded or offboarded? So on and so forth. And what's really, really important is that not all security approaches do this. Approaches that rely heavily on tools alone skip this step, because it doesn't matter to a tool how the system works. It doesn't matter if this particular device is going to be deployed in a government setting, in a banking setting, in a consumer setting, in an enterprise setting. It doesn't matter to a tool, because a tool just looks for sort of known issues. It doesn't necessarily analyze all the context around the system and how the system works. The next phase, I'm going to introduce, these are 2 different things, but I'm going to introduce them together because there's a lot of overlap. So the next thing we need to do, you need to run scanners that, like I just mentioned, look for known issues that can quickly be identified, the sort of proverbial low-hanging fruit, right? This is where this is the first thing the attacker is going to do too. So let's go quickly see what the easily identifiable problems are. And those scanners tend to look for, they are looking for known vulnerabilities. Now, some known vulnerabilities you have to look for manually. You can't run a tool for some of them. But that's why I'm presenting them together. There's a little bit of overlap. So these are things where you might be familiar with something like the OWASP top 10, which is the 10 most common vulnerabilities in web apps. That's a good example of known vulnerabilities, or issues that are commonly not patched yet. That's a known type of issue. So these three elements make up what I refer to as the fundamentals of security testing. These are the basics. But here's the problem. This is where most organizations stop. And as I mentioned, actually, most security testing approaches skip part of this. They skip the design part. They just focus on the running automated tools that look for known vulnerabilities. And that's insufficient if you have something worth protecting. Now, before we can get to the advanced tactics, we have to identify that there's this gap. I've come to call it the capability gap, but the way I visualize it is, if you can imagine the Grand Canyon, right? You're standing on one rim of the Grand Canyon and the other rim's like all the way over there, and it's pretty much impossible to get across from one side to the other. That's sort of what this capability gap idea is like. There's this huge gulf between the basics that we just talked about and the advanced tactics that come next. And what's really important to note is that the fundamentals, they can be done with medium, moderate, even in some cases low amounts of skill, and they can leverage tools very effectively. Automation is a key part. But what comes next, the advanced tactics, these are largely manual, and they require a degree of experience and expertise by a human who's sort of connecting dots. And we'll talk about this idea as we go into it. But that's really the key distinction, is that it's not very easy to get to this other side where these advanced tactics are, that are where the important stuff lies. So the first example, or the first of the advanced tactics, is abuse functionality. Now, this concept is where you look at the way that a system is supposed to work. You take the actual functionality in the system and you figure out how can the functionality be used in an attack. So a very interesting analog metaphor I just saw the other day, actually, on TikTok, of all places. I saw this video of this guy in, I think he was in Santa Monica, somewhere in LA. And he was at a parking meter. And if you can think of what parking meters are supposed to do, right? There's functionality for you to put your coin in the slot. And when you put the coin in the slot, it registers payment as received and gives you a certain amount of minutes, right? It'll be like, okay, you put in a quarter, you get 12 minutes. Or I don't know if that's the actual conversion, but you put an amount of money, you get a certain number of minutes. The assumption is you put the coin in, and then that's the end of the coin. There's really no prevention from pulling the coin back out if you can figure out how to do that. And so this video I saw was this guy had taken one of those little green stirrers that you get at somewhere like Starbucks. It's the little stir, and then also sticks in the hole of the cap so that when you're traveling, it doesn't spill. So it's like short little green piece of plastic. And he had taped a quarter to the end of it. And as people were pulling into these parking spots, he was just walking up and just entering it, pulling it out, entering it, pulling it out, and doing that over and over again until it maxed out the meter. And this would happen like really, really fast. So by the time the person got out of the car, here's this guy who's like, I just got you free parking. And so, of course, you know, he was looking for like some sort of donation for his services. So maybe we shouldn't celebrate that was kind of stealing from the city. But the point is, that is not the way that the parking meter is supposed to work. But it did. That's the way that it worked. And that's what abusing functionality is like. You take the way a system, the components of the system, and say, can I make it do something it's not supposed to do? So to apply this to a technical exploit, we can look to a hacker that many of you guys might know, who goes by the pseudonym of Manfred. Now, Manfred was a very capable, or is still alive. Manfred is a very capable online game hacker who, for many, many years until he retired, was looking at the way that online games have these in-game currencies. So, for example, you might accumulate currency or buy currency in order to get like a skills upgrade or a weapons upgrade, or somehow enhance the in-game experience. And these games have this essentially in-game banking system that process transactions similar to this. Obviously, it's more complex than what I'm describing, but this is the way to simply think about it. You have your account balance, you withdraw a certain amount, and you're left with a new balance. So let's say that you had 500 coins. I mean, all the games call their currencies different things, so let's just go with coins. You have 500 coins, you take out 100 coins to get that skill or weapons upgrade, and you're left with 400 coins. 500 minus 100 equals 400. So what Manfred did was he pulled out one of the most powerful tools in the hacker toolkit. He asked, what if? He asked, what if I could use negative integers instead of positive integers? Because as you can see here, the withdrawal amount was expecting a positive number, positive 100. So what he was able to do was successfully exploit an issue that enabled him to do exactly that, to use negative integers when it was expecting positive integers. So what happened as a result? 500 minus negative 100. And as we learned in middle school, subtracting a negative is addition. So he'd grow his account balance and get whatever the skills or weapons upgrade was that he was buying and accumulate this, massive trove of this currency. And then he could turn around if he wanted to and sell it for real money in secondary markets to other players. Now, that's not the way the system was supposed to work. And it's a great example of abusing functionality. The banking functionality was abused. And here's a great example of where there's no tool. You can't automate this. This requires a human to look at a system and understand the assumptions that are baked into it and ask those what if questions. Then we have chain exploits. Now, chain exploits is the idea of taking two or more issues and combining them. And by combining them, it actually multiplies the impact exponentially. So the analog metaphor here is when I was growing up, there was a kid in my neighborhood who had a trampoline. I was there all the time. What kid wouldn't, all right? And I vividly remember the day when we discovered the double jump. The double jump is this idea where when we're both bouncing on the trampoline, if we time it so that we're timing his landing of his jump, my friend's jump, as he's landing, I'm jumping, his downward velocity multiplies my upward velocity. And we discovered this because I got shot scared to death high. And, I hit there were these tree branches hanging over the trampoline, experienced a little moment of weightlessness, and then came speeding, crashing back down to earth. And of course, thought I was going to die on the way down. It was terrifying. But that day I learned a really important lesson. I learned this idea that two actions when combined are more impactful than either could ever be alone. My friend can only jump so high and I can only jump so high, but together I could jump, scared to death high. So let's apply this to a technical exploit. There's a project that we were working on recently where we found that this system had what's called information leakage as one of the issues that we discovered. Now, information leakage is where the system gives up information that it probably shouldn't. It's not directly exploitable on its own, not that big of a deal. You don't want it though. But in this case, information leakage meant that any user could identify any other user. Again, on its own, not that big of a deal. You don't want it, not that big of a deal. The second thing that we identified was that the authorization model was broken. So if someone wanted to change their credentials, they want to change their password, they did have to supply some information, but not the appropriate information. All they had to supply in order to change the password was a user identifier. Now, you know your own user identifier. You don't know anyone else's user identifier. In theory, that's all good. That means only you can change your password. But when you combine the issues, when you can identify every user and use that identifier in order to change every user's credentials, now you can take over every single account in the system. I mean, we're talking complete account takeover, including this applied to the admin users as well. This is the kind of worst case scenario that companies fear. And when you look at those issues, there's no tool that will help you do this. You need to do this manually, and it needs to have some human creative problem solving in order to connect dots to say, what if I took A and I combined it with B? What would happen? Perfect example of that. And then finally, the pinnacle of any sort of security testing is this idea of seeking the unknown unknowns. And these are issues that are so unexpected, you don't know to look for them or how to account for them. But the relentless pursuit of trying to continually advance the field and trying to find and identify new attack techniques, that is the arms race that we're in. Because you know what? The attackers are doing that. The attackers are relentlessly innovating, and they're not necessarily telling us what the innovation is. So it's on us, it's incumbent on the defenders, on the security community, to relentlessly be pushing to find unknown unknowns. And again, because it's unknown, there's no tool that you can run in order to identify these issues. Now, there's three types of unknown unknowns. I'm only going to focus on one of them, but to just briefly introduce the other two, one is novel versions of common vulnerabilities. So we talked before about this idea of like injection attacks or whatever. That's a common issue that is always on the list of the OWASP top 10. And so that's an example of a common vulnerability, but where it's new, where it's novel, is the way that that type of issue might manifest in your systems. Maybe it's never been seen before in that way, or it delivers an outcome that hasn't been anticipated before. That's an unknown that you don't necessarily know how to look for that particular attack scenario. The second is O-days in the supply chain. 0-day vulnerabilities are issues where the defender has 0 days in order to issue a remedy to the problem before it's exploitable. It's exploitable right now. So that's what a 0-day is. These are, the big bad problems. And the supply chain is anything that a system integrates with or relies on. So that might be third-party libraries, or integrating with third-party systems, or maybe leveraging a cloud platform, etc. What we're going to focus on today is this idea of previously unknown attack methods. And I'll illustrate with an example called request smuggling. Partly because I love that term. Request smuggling is just like, it's enjoyable to say. But request smuggling is a great example of what was once a previously unknown attack method. But in order to explain the attack method, let me give you some context. So web applications, they experience a lot of traffic. And there's essentially 2 ways you can handle that. There's more than 2, but for simplicity's sake, let's just say there's 2. One way is you can build one very expensive, very capable server to handle all that traffic. The other way is you can build a series of lesser expensive servers that can alternate the traffic. They can share the load. Now, in order to do that, you need what's called a load balancer. A load balancer is what essentially directs the traffic to different servers. Now, you can think of this like when you go to a big event, a big baseball game, or a music festival or whatever, and there's the parking attendant in the parking lot, and he's got the flags, right? And he's like, all right, this car goes in that lane, and this car goes in that lane. That's sort of what the load balancer does. They direct traffic to where it's supposed to go. Now, here's what's important to note. These are 2 different pieces of software. They are supposed to be implemented the same. But where there's a discrepancy, because again, they're 2 different things and it's humans doing this, so it's possible that discrepancies would be introduced. Where there's a discrepancy, attackers can exploit that. And so when all the stars line up for this particular attack condition to be possible, basically what happens is that an attacker can pair a legitimate request with a malicious request. And the load balancer will treat it as one single request, a legitimate request, but then the web server will treat it as 2 distinct requests. And with the malicious request, you can do all kinds of things: leak information, change credentials, exfiltrate information, all kinds of bad things. It's like the attacker toolkit is wide open at that point. Now, here's what's crazy about this. The timeline from when this attack technique first became possible to when it was first documented in security literature, that time frame was about 16 years. 16 years. Fast forward another 16 years in addition to that, and that's where we are today. And this attack technique, many people still don't really know about it, know it exists, or what to do about it. And that's why this relentless pursuit of trying to understand new attack methods and attack techniques is so critically important, because there might be an attack scenario actively underway right now that we haven't discovered yet. You have to be pushing to find those things. There's no tool to look for something else. You can't automate it. It needs to be manual, and it needs to be done by somebody who kind of can apply that human mindset and that problem-solving mindset. So to bring it all together, to summarize, the key point here is that if you have something worth protecting, you really need everything we described. But the problem is that most security today tries to leverage tools alone. I won't go on my diatribe right now about the problems with how the term penetration test has come to mean a bunch of different things, including mostly things that are not actually penetration testing. I'll save that for another day, and we can talk about that in the networking lounge if you guys want to. But the point is that this condition exists very widely, which is that a penetration test is usually just a vulnerability scan today. And a vulnerability scan, leveraging just tools alone, is insufficient. It's just a subset of some of the easier things, and you really need everything. You need all of these steps if you have a system that has something that's worth protecting. You also need all these steps if you want to be able to do that fifth principle, which is to prove it. You need to be able to go to your customer and say, here's why we're different. Here's our differentiator. Buy from us. Well, just running a scanner is insufficient to do that. You need this whole method. So with that, I pass the baton to you. Ideas are only as good as the action that you take on them. So while hopefully today helped you think a little bit differently about some of these ideas, that's not enough. If you walk away from here and all you do is say, well, that was a cool idea, then we haven't, as a community, achieved the mission. We need to go take action. And I have 3 actions that I'd recommend you can go do. First action is think of IoT security as an application security problem. That's the argument that I've been making today, that IoT security is not some new, like completely unseen thing that has all these new facets that you have, no bearing or no context around. Think of it as application security, and then that will help you think differently about the challenge. Second, make sure you're doing the right things to find those security vulnerabilities. And I'm saying that might be you. You might be the ethical hacker or the security tester, or you might work for a company that's hiring somebody. Either way, make sure that the right things are being done in order to make sure that you're actually able to find your issues so you can fix them. So when you go back to your organization, take a look at what you're doing for security testing. Are you getting those advanced tactics? Are you having a manual emphasis, or are you relying just on tools? And then finally, use me as a resource. I'm very, very accessible. If anything that we talked about today is triggering additional questions or ideas, I'm super easy to find. There's a bunch of different ways I could send you to, but maybe the simplest is just go to hackablebook.com. And there you'll find my contact information, how to reach out to me if you have questions. If you need help with your security testing, that's where you can hit me up too. If you want ideas, you want to learn more about the book and you want to pick up a copy or sign up for the waitlist for the audiobook that's coming out in a few weeks, that's all there. So hackablebook.com. And then, of course, join me in the Hackable Lounge. So as we wrap up here, I'm going to just take a minute to just drink some water, and then I'm going to head over to the Hackable Lounge, and it would truly, truly, truly be my honor to interact with any of you, answer any questions that you have, be a resource, like however I can help you, let me help you. And the reason is this is a community, and this is the way that I give back to this community. So please treat me as a member of the community and let me help you. So with that, I will end my time here, and thank you so very much. I can't wait to see you over at the Hackable Lounge.